The reason it's my favorite is because we get to compare two stories to one another. So when you compare, you have to have two things, and you talk about how they're the same and you talk about how they're different. Well, do you remember last week when we read the story Cinderella? Thumbs up if you remember that. Okay, I'm going to briefly pull up the PowerPoint of Cinderella, and we're going to look at it quickly and remember what the story was about. So in Cinderella was written by a man from a country called France in the year 1697. That was 300 years ago. That was like a super long time ago. So here's America where we live, and you would have to fly all the way over the Atlantic Ocean to Europe to France. Okay, here's the man that wrote Cinderella. His name was Charles Perrault, and he wrote that fairy tale. Now back then in France, people did have kings and queens. That was very common. Now they have a president like we do. Here, a vocabulary word that we learned was tattered. That means torn and rough looking. Tattered. This dress is tattered and torn. Another word that we talked about was ball. Ball can have more than one meaning. It can mean a fancy royal dance, or it can be a ball that you play with. So in the story Cinderella, as a little girl, Cinderella's father married another lady who was her stepmother, and the stepmother was really mean to her. She made her dress in tattered clothes and do a lot of chores and clean the floors, but it wasn't fair because she didn't make it equal. She didn't make it equal. The other stepsisters got to wear beautiful dresses and go to fancy parties, and Cinderella just really felt left out and sad. Well, one day there was a knock on the door, and there was an invitation to a ball, and all the eligible maidens could attend. But they told Cinderella, "Oh, you can't go to the ball. We don't want you to go." And so she helped her sisters and her mother get ready, but she didn't get to go, and that made her really sad. But it was lucky because she had a fairy godmother who was looking out for Cinderella. And she came and she told Cinderella to get a pumpkin and some mice. And she turned the pumpkin into a beautiful carriage and the mice into horses, and turned Cinderella into a beautiful ball gown with glass slippers. But she said, this magic only lasts a little bit. At the 12th stroke of midnight, you have to be gone, and everything turns back to the way it was. The coach turns to a pumpkin, the horses turn to mice, and you will go back to your tattered clothing. Well, Cinderella went to the ball, and she had a wonderful time. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew who she was. She danced with the prince all night long. But then she heard the clock chime. Remember, we talked about the chimes on a clock a long time ago? If it was 1 o'clock, it had 1 chime. 2 o'clock, 2 chimes. So midnight is 12 o'clock. So there were 12 chimes. So she heard the chimes and she panicked and ran away from the prince without telling him who she was. But as she was running, she left her glass slipper. The prince picked up her glass slipper and said, "Oh, that is how I will find the beautiful girl I danced with at the ball. I will try this slipper on every eligible maiden, and whose ever foot fits the slipper is the girl who is at the ball." So one of the king's servants went to Cinderella's house with the slipper and tried it on the awful stepsisters, but it did not fit their foot. Finally, Cinderella came down and he tried it on her, and guess what happened? It fit her foot, and she had the other glass slipper. So it turned out she was the wonderful maiden, so the mystery maiden. So she and the prince got married and lived happily ever after. That was Cinderella. Well, today we are going to take a look at, I'm going to escape this. We're going to read another fairy tale that's kind of like Cinderella, but a little bit different. This fairy tale is titled Cinderella Penguin, or The Little Glass Flipper. Get it? Flipper? Flipper? This is the flipper of the penguin. The arms of the penguin, those are the flippers. So the little glass flipper. It's not slipper, it's flipper. So that's what we're going to read today. Let's listen to this story. It's actually on Epic if you want to go back and hear it again. My friend Ryan was telling me that. Thank you, Ryan, for letting me know it was on Epic. Let's listen to the story, and we're going to compare both of these stories. Talk about how they're the same and talk about how they're different. Let's listen.
Cinderella Penguin, or The Little Glass Flipper. There was once a young penguin named Cinderella who lived in a faraway land with her stepmother and 2 stepsisters. Cinderella was a kind and gentle penguin, but her sisters were selfish and vain. Cinderella did all the chores. She even had to pick up after her stepsisters, while they never had to do a thing.
Okay. Is this already similar to Cinderella? Yeah, it is. Who can tell me something that's the same in this story that's the same about Cinderella? Landon?
The penguin had to do all the chores.
Right. She still had mean and selfish stepsisters and a stepmother that made her do all the work. And that is not fair. Okay, how else is it similar? Let's see if there's one other way. Carolyn, tell me another way that it's similar to the Cinderella we read last week.
The penguin is called the Cinderella.
She has the same name as the character, right? She still has the name Cinderella. And look, where's my pointer? There's the fireplace. And because of the wood burning, the cinders would fly out and smudge her face. All right, let's listen some more.
The sisters wore the finest of clothes and slept in large, cozy feather beds with silk sheets and fluffy pillows. Poor Cinderella wore nothing but worn-out tatters and slept in the cold stone cellar up on a small shelf beside some old tin plates. One day it was announced that the Penguin Prince was giving a costume ball. The stepsisters and their mother received an invitation. Cinderella wanted to go too, but they just laughed at her. The prince would never want to meet a shabby cinder block like you. For weeks the house was filled with talk of the ball. The sisters had costumes made from the finest fabrics. They ate only the tiniest meals so they could have the tiniest waists, and they were always in front of the mirror, posing and practicing their curtsies.
Okay. So once again, pretty similar, huh? Not quite the same, but close. Let's listen to some more.
Finally, the night of the ball arrived. Cinderella rushed about ironing her stepsisters' costumes and helping them dress. Then, without a thank you or goodbye, the carriage swept the stepmother and stepsisters off to the ball. Cinderella burst into tears. She felt so alone and unhappy. Suddenly, in a glow of blue light, the great fairy penguin appeared before her. "Why are you crying, Cinderella? Do you want to go to the ball?" she asked. Cinderella blinked back her tears. "Oh, yes, more than anything." "Then you shall. First," said the fairy penguin, "you must fetch me a pumpkin from the garden." Cinderella didn't know how a pumpkin could help her get to the ball, but she quickly brought her the best one she could find. The fairy gave it a firm tap with her wand, and it magically turned into a beautiful golden carriage. Then the great fairy penguin went into the kitchen and found 6 mice carrying a huge chunk of cheese. With a tap of her wand, they turned into a handsome team of 6 horses. She turned the cheese into a fat coachman in uniform. They all marched out the door and took their places, as if it were the most natural thing to do. "Now you can go to the ball. Are you happy, Cinderella?" asked the fairy. "Oh, yes," said Cinderella. But then she looked sadly down at her ragged clothes.
Okay. Look, those look like horses. They're kind of like penguins with the horse's tail. Still pretty similar, though. Let's look some more. Let's listen some more.
"Oh, I almost forgot," said the fairy, and with a tap of her wand, Cinderella Penguin's rags became a beautiful gown with gold trimming and a real gold tiara. On her feet were a pair of glass flippers, the prettiest and most delicate that Cinderella had ever seen.
Okay. Why do they call them glass flippers? Why do they call them that? Russell?
Yes, because it's just used to swimming and used to slip in, used to be faster in swimming.
You're right. We use flippers in swimming, don't we? A duck has a foot that looks like a flipper, so he can paddle quickly in the water. We don't, but a duck or a penguin also has a flipper as a foot, because penguins swim in water. So her foot doesn't look like a human foot. So instead of a glass slipper, I would think a penguin would need a glass flipper. Okay, let's listen some more.
"Now, one last thing," said the great fairy penguin. "The magic spell ends at the stroke of midnight. The carriage will turn back into a pumpkin, the horses back into mice, the coachman into cheese, and you will again be dressed in rags. So you must leave the ball before midnight." Cinderella promised to remember. Then, waving goodbye, she stepped into the carriage and rode off, her heart filled with joy. When Cinderella arrived at the palace, the ball was in full swing. She was welcomed with a fanfare of trumpets, and she marveled to see so many fine penguins wearing such magnificent costumes. Her stepmother and stepsisters didn't notice her. They were too busy gobbling down snacks and party sandwiches at the buffet tables. But the penguin prince noticed Cinderella at once. "Who is she?" he asked his courtiers. "She is the most beautiful penguin I have ever seen." Cinderella had never met as handsome and charming a penguin as the prince. From their first dance together, he never left her side. They whirled and twirled around the dance floor to the applause of the admiring crowd. "Who is the beautiful young penguin who has captured the prince's attention so completely?" everyone whispered. "What a handsome couple! How well they danced together!" They sighed. Cinderella had never been so happy. She wished the night could last forever. Then, suddenly, she glanced up at the clock. In all the excitement, she had completely forgotten the fairy's warning. "Oh," she cried, "it's almost midnight. I have to go." And she ran from the palace in such a hurry that one of her glass flippers fell off and was left lying on the steps. As Cinderella rode away in her carriage, the prince called out, "Oh, please don't go." But she was gone. He picked up the glass flipper and said sadly, "Who was she? I don't even know her name." The next day, it was announced that the prince would marry the penguin whose foot fit the little glass flipper. There was great excitement throughout the land. First, all the princesses tried it on, then all the penguins of the court, but the flipper was always too small. The royal footmen were commanded to take the flipper from house to house. The stepsisters spent the whole day perfuming and powdering their feet. "Cinderella," said the stepmother, "your clothes are too ragged to be seen by the royal footmen. Go downstairs and polish the silver until they leave." "Oh, please, I would like to try on the flipper too," said Cinderella, knowing it would fit her perfectly. The stepsisters laughed, but then they looked down at Cinderella's webbed feet. For the first time, they noticed how delicate they were.
What does that mean? They looked down at Cinderella's feet, and for the first time, they noticed how delicate they were. Look at the illustration. What do you notice? What does that mean? Her feet were delicate. We heard that word in The Princess and the Pea. Are we?
It means it's really fragile.
Very fragile. And in this case, if we look at her webbed feet compared to that, see, you can see the picture's kind of split in half, but that's a stepsister, that's a stepmother, that's another stepsister, and then there's Cinderella right here. Her feet are slightly smaller than the others too, so small and dainty. They noticed that. Landon, did you want to share something?
No.
Okay, so that must mean they're starting to figure out who was the mystery penguin at the ball. Let's see.
A knock came at the front door. "Quick, hide her," said the stepsisters. They grabbed Cinderella, threw her down the cellar steps, and slammed the door. Poor Cinderella. She lay upside down with her foot caught tight in the door,
Look,
unable
her
to get
foot's stuck,
free.
sticking out.
When the footman came in, the stepsisters pushed and shoved to be the first to try on the flipper. They were so intent on snatching the flipper from each other that it slipped from their grasp, flipped high in the air, and landed squarely on Cinderella's foot. Everyone stared. It was a perfect fit. As the footman opened the door and helped Cinderella up, the great fairy penguin appeared. With a tap of her magic wand, she transformed Cinderella's tattered rags into the magnificent clothes she had worn to the ball. Cinderella was overjoyed. "Oh, thank you, Fairy Penguin. I thank you with all my heart." The stepmothers and stepsisters' beaks dropped wide open. They stared at Cinderella, spluttering with amazement. "Look, oh my, it's her! Oh no, oh dear, we've really put our foot in it." The Penguin Prince and Cinderella Penguin were married the very next day, and the wedding bells rang throughout the land. Never before could anyone remember such a joyous and happy wedding. Cinderella and the prince truly loved each other, and they lived happily together ever after.
Okay. So, that was Cinderella Penguin. They also have the Penguin and the Pea instead of the Princess and the Pea. But very good. So, let's take a look. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And this, in our weekly agenda, there was a place where you could print out a graphic organizer called a Venn diagram. this is the Venn diagram. It looks like two hula hoops or two circles overlapping each other. In the first circle, we have the story that we read last week, Cinderella. In the other circle, we have Cinderella Penguin. And in the center, we have the word both. So, what this Venn diagram does is it lets you compare both stories. You can talk about how Cinderella, the story we read last week, was different, how this story was different, and what was the same. So I want to start talking about what was different about the story. What was something different in Cinderella Penguin that was different from the story we read last week, Cinderella? What is one difference? Estelle, tell me a difference.
When they said flipper instead of flipper.
Okay, she had a glass flipper. And in Cinderella, she had a glass slipper. All right. What's something else that was... Yes.
I haven't done my math video yet, so after listening and learning, can I do it?
Yeah, you can do it, sweet girl. All right, let's listen. What is something else that was different about Cinderella Penguin? That was different in that story? Landon?
She was a penguin instead of a girl.
Very good. So Cinderella, which I'm going to write her with a capital letter because that's her name. Cinderella was a penguin. And in this story, Cinderella was a girl or a woman. Very good. What's another difference we saw or heard? Ryan?
I want to tell you something.
What do you want to tell me?
There's another version of Cinderella on iPad. But it's the different part is Cinderella is a T-Rex.
Yes, there are so many different versions of this fairy tale. You're exactly right. Okay,
And the ball is different because there are penguins around it, but the Cinderella story, there are no penguins around it.
Right, exactly. This story has all penguins and the other one has all humans.
And I saw a penguin floating.
Oh, the fairy penguin? Yeah, she was small and floating.
I not see the fairy penguin.
Oh.
In the ball outside the castle, there's a penguin.
Oh, I missed that part. Okay, Nicole, what's something you want to share that was different about Cinderella Penguin?
Cinderella penguin was the sister had looking the glass, but the Cinderella didn't look at the mirror.
Okay, Also, what about at the end when they put, so they, in Cinderella Penguin, they shut the door on her, the slipper fell on the penguin's foot in Cinderella Penguin. So the glass, you mute your microphones, the glass slipper fell on Cinderella's, I put my apostrophe on her foot. And in this one, the prince's servant put the slipper on her foot. Okay, excellent. What was something that was the same about both stories? What was something that was the same? Carolyn?
The same is
In both, did she have evil, a mean stepmother and stepsisters? Were the stepsisters
Yes.
mean? Okay. So in both books, the stepsisters were mean. They were not kind to Cinderella. What else was similar about both of them? What else was the same? Someone I haven't called on. Smriti, tell me something that was the same.
she lost the glass slipper fell.
Yeah, in both books, she lost the glass. You can mute your microphone back. Slipper or flipper. Slipper/flipper. Okay. How else was it the same? Landon?
They both had the fairies.
They both had fairy godmothers. You're exactly right. They both had fairy godmothers. Excellent. Okay, so if we look back at our Venn diagram, we have organized all of our information onto here. So we can see in the story Cinderella, there was a glass, the thing that was different. Here, I'm gonna mute all the microphones really quick so we don't have background. Okay. In the Cinderella that we read last week, there was a glass slipper. In this book, there was a glass flipper for swimming in the water. Last week's story, Cinderella was a girl. In this story, Cinderella was a penguin. In last week's story, the prince's servant put the slipper on Cinderella's foot. In the story we just read, the glass flipper fell on Cinderella's foot. And some similarities that we found, things that were the same, in both stories there were stepsisters and they were mean. And in both stories, Cinderella lost the glass slipper / flipper. And in both stories there were fairy godmothers. Great job comparing these books, friends. Tomorrow, we're going to compare the Snow White fairy tale, the fairy tale titled Snow White. We're going to compare it to another book called Snow White as Told by the Seven Dwarfs. So that's going to be different. Okay. Yes.
Do we have to submit this?
You don't have to submit it, sweetie. If you want to, you can, and I gave you an option to do that. If it's too much, now listen, friends, this is a lot of words. If you don't want to write the words, draw a picture. Draw a picture of a glass slipper and draw a picture of a glass flipper. Then draw something that is the same that happened in both stories. So you might draw the glass slipper or the glass flipper on the steps of the castle, or you might draw the stepsisters being mean and angry. So you can put pictures instead of writing the phrases if that is too much for you. Is that good? Now you do have the option to do this if you want to. All right, my friends, I am so proud of you. This was a fun lesson, and we will be back to our normal schedule tomorrow, completely normal with small group and everything. So I will see you guys tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.
Miss Kate.
Bye-bye.
Bye.